but you are responsible for the physical safety of your family. The question is, can you do it? And if the answer is no, well, then you need to go figure out how to do it.
Hey friends, welcome to the Victor Marks Podcast with Victor Marks, founder of All Things Possible Ministries. Welcome to the show where we bring you real conversations faced with life's hard truths, stories of redemption, and the latest from the front lines. Whether you're on the road, getting your day started, or finally settling in, we've got an exciting new episode planned for you. So let's dive into today's show.
Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of the Victor Marks Show. I have got a new friend, someone that I respect and have followed and met through Instagram on social media. Nick Freitas, he's over 250,000 followers. If you haven't, check this dude out. I highly recommend it. Nick is a husband, father, former Green Beret. He was a combat vet, and definitely involved in the political scene. And I appreciate him coming on. I would say this, folks, and Nick, this is what I tell people. I watch your stuff, and I look at you and I go, if I was younger, better looking, smarter, and a tad bit tougher, I think that would be you. Welcome to the program, brother.
Well, I appreciate it. That's about as nice an intro as I think I've ever received. or as I like to say, that was a very nice intro. My father would have enjoyed it. My mother would have believed it.
Yeah, I know. I just did a men's event out in North Carolina, out your way on the East Coast this past weekend. And after that introduction, I was, I'm on stage. I'm like, gosh, I actually have to live up to that now. That's, but hey, man, thanks for coming on the program. Let's start with your background.
Sure.
Why didn't you join the Marines?
Well, I could read, I could write. They weren't interested in me.
Tell the truth. Tell the truth. You couldn't handle crayons.
The taste is just horrible, as you know. I mean,
yeah. Well, it depends on what color. I'm fond of red when I'm living on the edge.
Yeah.
So you joined the Army right out of high school. And then, like most young men back in our day, and then after 9/11, everything happened, you volunteered to go the SF route and become a Green Beret. Why?
Yeah. Well, so I'd been in the 82nd Airborne. That was my first unit. And then we had just gotten over to Hawaii, and like 3 months later, 9/11 happened. And I can remember watching the news, and one of the first instances where we lost a lot of guys all at once was that helicopter crash with the Rangers that were going in to get out a SEAL.
Yeah. And
on that helicopter, I had one guy, Bradley Crouse, who I went through basic training with, and then Mark Anderson, who I went to Ranger School with. Were both died on that flight. And I remember talking to my wife at the time, and we had almost, prior to 9/11, when I was still at the 82nd, I was going to get out and go be a cop. My dad was a cop. I was going to go be a cop because it was peacetime Army, and there just wasn't a whole lot going on. And then when 9/11 happened, I was like, well, I'm staying in now. And then when that happened over in Afghanistan, I told Tina at that point, I'm like, look, I want to go with one of these units, and I was really impressed with what Special Forces was doing. I mean, there weren't a lot of young infantry guys, right? Tabbed infantry guys watching, Green Berets on horseback that weren't pretty impressed by that. And so that was the route I decided to go, and ended up with 1st Special Forces Group, and then went over to Iraq with our A team, what better known as an ODA, in 2006, and then again in 2008.
There's a lot of guys who signed up, didn't see combat, came back frustrated. What would you tell them?
I mean, I honestly, I get it. I really do. My neighbor was in the service, had served in Ranger Regiment for a while. And it was one of those things where by the time 9/11 rolled around and there was all these combat tours, he was in the reserves. His reserves never got called up. He was looking for ways to do it. And he always felt like something was missing, or he hadn't accomplished something because he had gone overseas. And he was really instrumental in my life in we were neighbors, and instrumental in getting me back into church and recognizing my responsibility as kind of a husband and a father and the spiritual head of the household and all that. And, I remember telling him, Anthony, man, for what it's worth, I'm in SF. I've been to combat. I'd go to combat with you any day. But God has us in the place he's going to have us at the time he's going to have us there. And I can understand the frustration, and I can understand almost this sense of regret on something you didn't get to do. I have that about certain things. And then every once in a while I just got to sit back and remember, okay, well, it's like, Anthony, it's not like you weren't willing. It's not like you backed out of a deployment, right? You were looking for one. It didn't happen. God has a reason for that. You're either going to trust him in that moment or you're not.
That's
and
good.
That was easy for me to say at that time because I'd got to go overseas and do that. But then, believe me, there was other moments in my life where it was like, okay, God, I don't know what you're doing right now, and I really don't know why you're doing it. But, I've heard this before. I've given advice to other people before. We've told our kids what we believe. Now's the time to demonstrate it. So I would just say if we're too focused on our plans, a lot of times you get too focused on your plans and God will let you carry them out. And it is never as good as what he's got. So,
well, that's good. I tell folks, me and my chief of operations, who was with CAG for 10 years, Colonel Teagues, and he was enlisted. He was a Ranger, and then went SF, and then it was meant for him to be a Delta Force. We were walking through an airport one time, and a guy saw my dog, and we started talking, and then he says something about, oh yeah, I was in, and he goes, but I never went outside the wire. I always stayed in the fob. But he said it was like, I'm less than, because I never did. My response was, hey man, you raised your hand. Mm-hmm. You raised your hand. You took the oath. You're willing to fight. You're trained to fight. You're willing to die for what you believe. That's what matters. And Teagues lit him up a little bit more, just by saying, don't ever diminish your role, because it's not the door kickers or, shooting somebody that makes a difference. It's the whole team. It's everybody doing their job, running in their lane, right? And I think it's such good advice for men even now, because in our country, men are looking, young men, they're looking for something, a mission in life. I currently can't tell them with clear conviction, hey, you ought to jump in the military, because a lot of factors. And if God's leading them, okay. But wherever God has you, man, flourish, push through, do your very best, because young men are needed these days. I served, people ask me, was that in the Iraq War? I go, no, but I've been 16 times to Iraq, and it started when I was, I think, 49. Wow. And I still have a house in Iraq because of the ministry that we do. But I served in the Marine Corps under President Reagan in the 80s. But I say, look, the leadership training I got then, it still worked for me all the way as someone in their 50s doing the deal, facing ISIS, getting shot at, having to shoot, move and scoot, and, doing what we were doing, recovering women and children. Wow. And it's important for young men listening right now to find someone that you respect, listen to their counsel, older guys, and then push and train hard, embrace hardship, because what you need, and it's not talked about often, but is resiliency. What would you say to that? How does a young man develop resiliency in a very marshmallow, soft world?
The bottom line is there's adversity out there. It's a question of whether or not you're shirking your responsibility, you're hiding from adversity, or you're recognizing that one of the roles of a man, and I think God just put this into us, is that it's to go out there and confront dangerous situations in order to make it safe. Yeah. It's amazing. You're talking about the mission that you're doing over in Iraq. I got a friend of mine, Dave Eubank, with Free Burma Rangers, and I remember asking Dave once when this was before Iraq. It was when he's still doing the work in Burma, but at that point, he had his wife and his kids out there, and his kids were pretty little. I think he had 2 daughters and a son, if I remember correctly.
Yep.
And we're talking to Dave, and I remember we're sitting there. I'm like, Dave, look, I get it. You were a Ranger back guy, detailed to SF. You've done this stuff. I get how you do it. I even get maybe to a degree, your wife wanted to do it. Hey, she's a grown woman. But how do you do it with your kids too? And he said, Nick, my family has made a decision that we are not going to have our decisions dictated to us by a quest for comfort or fear. And man, that just stuck with me because he was on mission. He had a mission. He knew he was where God had him. He knew he had his family where God had him, and he was going to go do it. And he was going to go faithfully do it. And that's really impressive to me. And the reason why I bring it up in part is because, again, his kids were doing this stuff at a fairly young age. Now, he wasn't doing anything like grossly irresponsible. It's not like he was throwing his kids into, combat or something like that. But they were having experiences and learning an appreciation for living out their faith in a dangerous circumstance in a way that most Americans simply can't relate to. We've grown up in relative peace, prosperity, security. Now, obviously, there's exceptions to that rule. There's people that have had personal experiences. There's people that grew up in bad neighborhoods or in bad families. I mean, that. We know this.
Yep.
But there's a lot of other, I think you said it right, there's a lot of other men out there looking for a mission. And there's this idea, this whole idea of like toxic masculinity, where they've essentially taken certain traits that have a negative application and they turn the entire trait into toxic. Being aggressive, being able to engage in violent behavior if necessary, that's not toxic. What makes it toxic is who you apply it toward, right? You should be dangerous because you need to be able to protect the people. Because dangerous people that have ill intent are not afraid of weak people simply because you're soft and you pose no threat to them. And so I think it's about understanding that in everybody's life, there's certain adversity that will come up. And then there's other mission sets that you can choose. It may be in the mission field. It may be in the military. It may be in law enforcement. It may be as a first responder. It may be in something else. But the question is that are you going to develop yourself and allow yourself and train yourself in order to be equipped to deal with those dangerous situations? Maybe not as a career, but I think it starts with men understanding that regardless of what you choose to do with your life, and I think this is especially true once you get married, once you have kids, you are responsible for their physical safety. Not just their physical safety. You got to provide. You need to be the spiritual head of your household. You need to do all those things. But you are responsible for the physical safety of your family. The question is, can you do it? And if the answer is no, well, then you need to go figure out how to do it. I had a kid that came up to me. I'd known his parents. We'd known him for a while. He goes, Mr. Freitas, I want to be in the military. I said, well, what do you want to do? And he goes, well, I think I want to be a Green Beret. And right off the bat, I'm like, man, your mom's going to kill me. Your mom's going to kill me. You go be SF. I'm going to get blamed for this. But I remember asking him, I said, hey, teenage boy, been in sports, the whole deal. I remember asking him, I said, have you ever been punched in the face? And he goes, no. I said, all right.
Stand by.
Meet me over at the gym until we're gonna go through this. And he's like, really? I said, yeah, because it's going to happen to you, and I don't want the first time it happens to you to be in a dangerous situation. I want you to, and we worked through and we developed, grappling and self-defense and fighting and doing all of this. But there's this idea that we've always got to, protect people from adversity or protect people from danger. You can't do it. It is going to come along at some point in your life. The only question is are you going to be ready for it? Are you going to be prepared for it? And then as a man, I would argue you have an additional responsibility because it's not just going to be about defending you. It's going to be about defending your wife. It's going to be about defending your children. It's going to be about defending maybe someone else that can't defend themselves. And when you embrace that and you actually develop the necessary skill sets to address it, that builds confidence, which leads to that resiliency, to where when you do get hit down, your immediate response is not to lay there or to run away. It's to understand that life's not always going to be fair. Bad things are going to happen, and your job is to get up and do something about it. Yeah,
good copy on all. These are nuggets for young men and probably some older men listening. And I would think and say on the converse, there are some young men who look at this challenge and they say, I just can't do it. I don't have a dad to lead me through it. And they start to drift toward being passive, and some drift hard to being kind of extreme feminine to where it's just their way out. But maybe even in the deepest part of them, they really wanted to be a strong man. And I'll come back to that. But I smile when you talk about that fella named Dave Eubank.
Yep.
And folks, listen, if you've never seen the movie Free Burma Rangers, both of us highly recommend it.
Absolutely.
It's being streamed, and it's incredible. But in the movie and then his book, Dave Eubank talks about a fella that brought him from an operation he was on in Burma into China, then into Iraq for his first time in mission in Iraq. Guess who that guy was? Me.
I didn't know that. That's great.
I knew you'd get a kick. That started it. That started it all. And of course, Dave, like you SF dudes, I'll never forget. You know, he comes. It was him and Peter, and then we added. But I'll never forget. He's like, "Hey, are you going to use this room in your house?" I was like, "No." He goes, "Yeah. Can I put some gear in there?" Then 6 months later, hey, the upstairs room, total SF. Next thing I knew, I literally said, "Hey, Dave, how about you keep this safe house, run it as your HQ? I'll just go get another one." He's like, "Are you sure?" I'm like, "Yeah, pretty sure. Since you've got maps and tacticals and everything set up on the walls." So yeah, Dave is as close as a brother to me. We've done stuff in Burma together, and then much activity in Iraq. And in his film, I'm the quiet guy, seldom seen. But we've
and it's a small world.
Very small world. Yeah. So actually, I was just with him 2 weeks ago. He came here to Colorado, and we spent some time together. Him and his family. Love them. I'm an uncle to the kids. Amazing kids.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. Young men. The next thing is girls. This is what I hear from young ladies all the time. Where are the men? Mm-hmm. Where are the guys we can date? Now you have kids. I've got 5. 3 are daughters. 2 are sons. 2 of my daughters are married. I got one who's not, but whoever wins her hand will pass the muster, I guarantee you. But I'm a grandfather. I don't think you're there yet. And
not yet.
Grandfather to 4 granddaughters, and we just found out we got another granddaughter on the way.
Oh, wow.
Right? So, of course, this makes me lean heavily toward, we got to raise, we have to change the tide. We've got to, my approach, and I have a book coming out called The Dangerous Gentleman. And I think that's what we need to get back to. You embody that because of what you've lived, how you were raised. And, but yeah, young women out there, I would say this to the gals listening. If you're a single, don't compromise your values to try to get a dude.
Yeah.
It's if sex is what got and kept a dude, then prostitutes would be the most sought after women for wives. Yeah. And we all know they're not. And I don't say that with any, harsh judgment, because we rescue and recover lots of gals. And my father was a pimp at one time in his life. But I say it to say, gals, you're worth waiting for.
Yeah.
You're worth being honored in that way. And learn to be patient. Pray for your future husband.
Yeah.
That's something I think a lot of people, it requires faith, but I think it does work. What would you say to young gals out there?
Well, I've got 2 daughters and a son. My oldest daughter just turned 20. My son's 17 and my youngest daughter's 14. And I remember when my oldest daughter was like in 5th grade and this little boy liked her at school or whatnot. And she told him that, well, I'm not allowed to, have a boyfriend or whatnot. Because that was our rule. Our rule is you don't date until you're 18 because what's the purpose? The purpose of dating is finding someone that you're going to marry. And a lot of people look at that and think, well, that's ridiculous. Your kids aren't actually going to do that. Like, really? Because, okay, I've got one that's 20 and she's done it. I've got one that's 17. He's done it. I got one that's 14. She's done it so far. So no, what it is that when you take the time to reinforce healthy relationships in your child's life, and they have the promise that they have the ability to have that healthy relationship, the question is, okay, how do you get that? And two things that I always know, and I tell guys this all the time. If you're telling your daughters that, oh my gosh, she better be home by 10 and I'll kill anybody that touches her, and you better do this and you better do that, and then you look at your son and you're like, hey, go have a good time, buddy. Right. What you said was you set up a double standard. And whenever you do that, what you've done is you've turned your son into the sort of man or the sort of guy that you're telling your daughter to avoid. And then you've told your daughter that the rules don't really matter, and quite frankly, they're a little bit sexist.
That's good.
When in reality, you should be telling both of them, look, God has somebody for you, right? I firmly believe God has somebody for you.
I agree.
The question is, and I remember telling my kids this at a relatively young age when they're old enough to understand. I was like, it's fine to get the butterflies and everything else when somebody likes you and whatnot. But if you're not prepared to seriously consider somebody, then you're either playing with their heart or you're letting them play with yours. And then the other thing you want to ask yourself is, how much when you meet that person that you are just in love with, like, this is the one God has put in your life that you're going to build a family with, how much do you want to have to explain to them? How much do you want to have to explain to that person that you absolutely love with everything inside you, because you want to do all this stuff with these other people that you didn't really care about? Do you want to have that conversation? How long do you want it to be?
Yeah.
And I didn't say that, and I don't say that because people can't make different decisions younger in life and then, come around. I'm not saying that. It's just that I'm responsible for educating and raising my kids in a way that's going to set them up for the most success possible. And this is another thing parents do all the time that drives me nuts. I would have parents look at me and be like, wow, you don't let your kids do this. You don't let your kids do that. Was that your rule growing up for you? I'm like, no. They're like, don't you think that's hypocritical? A, no. And B, I don't care. My job is not to push my kids into all the stupid decisions I might have made.
Yeah.
My job is to use my experience in order to help them navigate around those things in order to make better decisions for themselves. That doesn't mean, they don't face any sort of challenges or hardships or what. No, what it means is that when you have something that's a moral issue, you help them navigate that so that they aren't carrying baggage into future relationships. So they aren't doing that sort of thing. And I couldn't agree with you more when I look at, when I talk to my daughters, or when I had this video I did on social media that went kind of viral. It's at this point, it's got about 50 million views. And it was just 3 things I learned about raising daughters. And what I did is I told people, I said, when my wife and I found out that she was pregnant with our first daughter, I went to 2 people to ask advice. The first one was my wife, because she's a woman and I figured she knows some stuff. The second person was the biggest dog I served with in the military. I mean, this guy would go out to the bar every night and make separate rounds. And I remember going up to him and I said, how do I protect my daughter from someone like you?
Yep.
And what he said, and he good sport, what he said was, he goes, tell your daughter you love her, because if you don't, someone who doesn't will, and she will believe him. I said, and that taught me 3 things with my girls. I said to make sure that I told my girls I loved them, and to make sure that was reflected in my actions, to make sure that my girls knew that they could always come to daddy. They could always talk to daddy. I never wanted to create this relationship of like, oh, I can't tell. No, you can always come to me. You can always come to your father. And then I kind of joked that, and I also taught him how to shoot just in case, right?
Right.
but it was the idea that demonstrating that they knew I loved them, that they could always tell me the truth, and that I would always tell them the truth. Created an environment where they had a certain expectation for what love, honor, and respect meant. And the second part of that I did in a different video later was like, and I also I always try to remember too that, loving, honoring, and respecting my wife is not just something that I do because God requires it. It's not just something I do because she deserves it. It's also something I do because my kids are watching. And my son, my little girls, they're going to develop in their minds, whether I say it or not, they're going to develop in their minds a reasonable expectation for what relationships look like based off of how I treat their mother.
Dad's setting a standard.
Yeah.
Dad's setting a standard. You know what you said about people would say, well, did you do this when you were a kid? This is what I tell parents. You're not a hypocrite if you still don't do it. I mean, if you're a single mom sleeping around and then you tell your daughter don't sleep around, well, you are a hypocrite. And believe me, what you say will have no value. And we've seen that with girls that we helped and where they come from. And I'm like, my gosh, come on. But it's so important that parents understand the role and the influence that they have. Even when you think your kids hate you. This is the number one thing I say to young people. And it's normally in public. And I go, hey, that's your dad or that's your mom? Yeah. I said, then here's the most important thing I can tell you. Trust them when you least agree with them. Trust them in those moments that you least agree with them, because they've been through the minefield and they know how to get you through it. Yeah. You're not always going to agree with your parent, nor should you, because you're growing up. But when you're just so upset and go, just tell them, I don't agree with you. But I remember Mr. Mark said something about, I just got to trust you, because very soon you'll be out there on your own making it. And,
I think we also have something of a crisis, though, with Christian parenting in this country, because I run into one of the things that I do is I talk a little bit about what's going on within our schooling system, because I sit on the education committee in the Virginia House of Delegates. Wow. And so I like to inform parents, like, hey, this is what's going on. You know, you need to understand what the environment your kids are going into. And one of the things that I caution them on, I said, but when your kids come to you with hard questions, and to include hard questions you don't know the answer to, if you get upset with them, or if your only response is, that's not the way we raised you, after a while, they're going to stop going to you with the questions, and they're going to go to somebody else. And you don't know what the other person is going to tell them, because that other person probably doesn't love for them or care for them the way you do. And the other thing that I think is just absolutely critical with kind of like a biblical worldview when it comes to raising kids is if you are the only authority, right? If your kids have to do what you say because you said so. Now, I'm not talking about 2-year-old and 3-year-old. They can't comprehend the discussion. But when they start to get a little older and they have that basic comprehension, if the only thing that you're teaching them is do what I say because I said so, and then there's punishment or reward based off of what you say, what you're not teaching them values. Right. You're teaching them an arbitrary adherence to authority. And when all of a sudden you're not the authority anymore, when it's the college professor, when it's the boss, when it's somebody else.
Well, that's good. That's really good.
All they're going to remember is there's rewards for obeying authority and there's punishments for opposing it. And so one of the things that, again, there by the grace of God go I, because we definitely made mistakes with this, but it was something that we were able to learn fairly early on, was that, the Scripture and God, that's the standard for right and wrong. Yes. My authority doesn't, me saying it's right and wrong is not based off of my authority. Right. It's based off of God's authority. And so my job and my responsibility, my wife's responsibility was to guide them in that. But here's the toughest part. And every parent's going to experience this at some point. This is the toughest part. It's so critical. I will never forget the day when my oldest daughter, I think she's about 14, she knocks on my door. And she goes, Daddy, can I talk to you? Yes, sweetheart, what's up? She goes, I don't think you handled something very well. Now, every ounce of me wanted to be like, oh, you don't now. You don't think I handled something very well. Oh, okay, well, good deal. Because last time I checked, you're living in my house, eating my food, like all that stuff, right? But she was respectful. And so I stopped that initial, like, kind of alpha male, like, who are you talking to? It's like, okay, go ahead, sweetheart. What do you mean? She goes, well, Daddy, when you got home, you came into the kitchen, you saw that Luke and Allie had messed something up, and you got mad at them. She goes, but you didn't ask them why they were doing it. They were actually trying to do something for you. Ooh. And you got mad at them, and so they just stopped and cleaned it up. But that was the other half of it, and you didn't find out why they were doing it before you got. And in that moment, you're realizing, like, oh, my gosh, she is right. I am wrong. I don't want to admit it.
Right. Yeah.
But I can remember like, okay, and Tina's always reminded me of this, like, all right, did you pray before you responded? And I was like, you know what? In this moment, there's a much bigger lesson at play here, because in this moment, if I get upset with her, if I kick her out and I say, well, hey, look, they shouldn't have done it, they should have asked me, if I do any of that, what I've just taught her is that the things that I've been telling her to do and model her life after don't apply to me. I'm the authority figure. And then there's no universality with it, right? Then it's not a good moral principles that God has given us that mold all of our lives. No, it's just an arbitrary rule I'm imposing on her. But if in this moment I can swallow my pride and say, you know what, sweetheart, you're right. Daddy's wrong. I appreciate you bringing this to me, and I'm going to go say sorry to Luke and Allie. In that moment, what I will have demonstrated to her is that the rules that I have the obligation as the head of the household to enforce also apply to me, because none of us are above God's law. And at that point, she'll believe it as this is true. It's not what I have to do because Dad said so. It's what I have to do because it's morally correct and it's true. And I think that is so important for us to recognize, is that sacred authority that you have as a parent is an authority that's been essentially delegated to you. You're not the one that created the authority. You're not the one that created the rules. Your job is to shepherd them through that so that they understand it and recognize that it's true. And one of the most powerful impacts you can have in that moment is when you acknowledge to your child, again, they need to do it respectfully, but you acknowledge your child, you're right and I'm wrong. You're right. That is the standard, and I fell short of it, and I appreciate you telling me about it.
Well, that brings both hope and help to a dad, whether he's young or whether he's older, dealing with stress. And I'm sure some of you men listening right now are drinking that in. And let me kind of bring it to the next level of when you really blown it. Now, I can speak to this with all experience, both losing my temper in the house. I remember one time I lost my temper and decided to put my fist through the wall by the front door. And I did. Yeah. And I remember, my family kind of going, holy smokes. My first thought was, Lord, thank you. There wasn't a, 2x4 there. That's it. And the second, as I'm wiping stuff off my fist, I just said, kids, that's not a great example at all of a father. That's me losing my temper and deciding to punch something. That is not a representation of your Heavenly Father, because he never loses his temper like that. And I said, I don't want to make any of y'all scared, and I'm sorry. And please forgive me. I mean, I just owned it real quick. And dads, that's what you do. You own stuff. Because it's your pride that typically will get you. And anger is a secondary emotion. And typically my anger comes out of protectiveness or, control issues. But I remember my wife was like, well, I'll call the guy to have it fixed. Or she was going to put a painting over it real quick. I said, you know what, babe? Leave that there. She's like, honey, people come over and they're going to ask. I said, good, let them ask so I can own that for a season. Yeah. And I did. Another time was losing my temper with my wife, and I just got back from Iraq. Some of you can relate if you've been to the sandbox. Things aren't processing correctly. I'm still in the fight deal and can't sleep and all that nonsense. And I remember we got into an argument. We're parked on our property. We got some land out here. And I just hit a point where I just opened my door, drew my weapon, unloaded a magazine into a tree, took a breath, and got back in the car. And Eileen goes, feel better? I go, yeah, oddly I do. Yeah,
Yeah.
And my wife's been with me 34 years.
Yeah.
She's like, yeah, okay. But but guys, be careful about scaring your wives. And what my wife learned is, just because it looks like I'm out of control, I'm not. Yeah. There's a big difference. Now, dudes, if you are out of control, you need to get a handle on that. But the way you release, make sure people aren't scared from it. And there's a fruit of the Spirit called self-control that I go, Lord, that's apparent. It's a bad fruit report right here. I got some bruised fruit.
Yeah. No, it's I remember, I think when I got back from, I think it was my first tour in 2006, on the team when we were going out places, I rode the gun a lot. And the rules in Iraq, man, is like if a Humvee's going down the road, everyone else is supposed to get off the road. And there was plenty of times where people got a little bit close and they got a couple of 50 cal rounds off to the side of the road to remind them that, they were not supposed to be there. The very first time I'm driving when I get back, we fly into SeaTac Airport, get home. I got my wife, my mom, and my little kids in the back of the car, and this guy cuts me off.
Oh my.
And before I could process that, some words flew out of my mouth that were I was not speaking in tongues. I'll just put it that way.
We call it potty mouthing.
Yeah, it was. I was not speaking in tongues. And like I had, and by the time I finally came back into focus, I was on the side of the road. I had gotten out of the car and I was yelling at the car.
Yeah.
As it was driving away, and I got back in, and Tina's like, "You okay?" I was like, "Yeah, I guess that was a bit of an overreaction." And she goes, "Yeah, hon, I think it was." And but I explained it to her, right? I didn't also just keep her in the dark about what was going on. I was like, "Well, babe, here's the deal. Over there, like that could mean, somebody not obeying our commands or not doing the right thing. That could get you blown up." And so, I'm still fresh in this mindset of this is how this is supposed to work in this situation. And now I'm reacclimating myself to the rules back home. Because the rules are different,
and it is difficult at times. Right now, Nick, I have a team over there, and I was supposed to be on it, but we decided I have to stay and do some things. We have two teams making a difference right now over there, and for guys. Well, first, for those of you who don't understand, when he was on the gun. Humvee is a turret, guys up in it on a 50 cal. He can hurt a lot of feelings, a lot of power on a trigger pull. And I'll tell you, I got to say this about David. I just got to, folks, I'm talking to Nick like we would be hanging out at, in our living room on the back porch. So we're doing a movement. It's the west side of Mosul, and it's retaking Mosul, right? We're embedded with the Iraqis. General Mustafa at the time. Me and him are the only Americans. It's literally a two-man team. And we're I think this was 17. But we're in this Humvee, we're kind of crunched in, and they put a guy, the Rockies put a guy in the turret because it was there. And I'll never forget Dave look at him. Dave goes, "You are fat. You're just, how do you even fit in there? Do we need to get you some Oreos?" And Dave just kept dogging this guy. It's because we wanted one of my guys in there who was SF, and he was a Sergeant Weapons.
Bravo. 18 Bravo.
Yeah. So just like you. And he's good on a gun. But what's funny, because I remember we're heading toward his village, and I've got some pretty good glass. Looking at something, I'm like, "Hey man, there's a vehicle that's pulled up, and there were IEDs everywhere, V-beds rather." And I was just going, "This bad." This guy ended up being one heck of a shooter.
Really?
Unbelievable. Like Dave was like,
give the kid a 50 cal in a hot pocket, and right?
he is just all about it. So we laughed our head off, but. Guys, hey, if those of you who, struggle, have challenges from sleep, I'm going to tell you, contact me or go to mytriawellness.com. mytriawellness.com. My wife and I developed a sleep aid. It's all natural. The best sleep aid I've ever had. Because for me, 3 days of no sleep, I become mayor of Crazyville, and things don't really work out. But this is all natural. Last night I slept, you ready for this? I'm going to make some people jealous. 8 hours and 29 minutes because I have a timer. The night before it was 6 hours 40, but I'm sleeping between 6.5 to 7.5 hours consistently. And this is only in the last year. But we developed this product, so I'd love to get it in y'all's hands. Or you can just contact me at victormarks.com and say, hey, send me a link for that. It makes a difference because you can't substitute sleep. You can substitute a lot of other stuff, but not sleep. So, Nick, what's next for you, man? What do you I just saw your last video. You're living on the edge, man. You're looking at buying a cow. You're doing
we've got so I'm still in the Virginia legislature. So I serve there in the state house, and then I still do some work on the security side, the consulting side for the most part.
Yep.
And then we have our podcast, Making the Argument, with our team, where we kind of go through a lot of different issues. Some of the stuff that we've talked about here today, some of it more political, and the big goal on that was to try to equip people with like good, sound, logical, empirical arguments. We've also got another program we do called the Why Minutes. It's just these kind of like little 3-minute breakdowns of various issues where we have some sort of principle, but it's kind of like a neat story to illustrate the principle. So that keeps me really busy. And then, we've got 10 acres in Central Virginia. We're trying to expand. We'd like to get some more, land, but right now we got our chickens, we got our goats, we got our dogs, our cats. We've had pigs before. We've got peacocks because we're idiots. And this next year we do like our gardening and whatnot. But this next year, I really just fell in love with like the homesteading community.
Yeah.
Just so many really, really good people. Joel Salatin up here is, a great guy, and he's in the Shenandoah Valley. And then, got to meet some other people. Got to meet some other people within the homesteading community, like, Jess from Roots and Refuge, and got to meet the Rhodes family, and, John from Warrior Poets Society. So we've been, for a while, we've been kind of like increasing our own little output for our family.
Nice.
But this next year, that's our first year we're expanding into cattle, some beef cattle, probably get a dairy cow. And we'll probably do pigs again as well. And part of the reason why we wanted to do it is I think it's fun. I like it. I also like the idea of it goes back to, it's funny you say that word resilience, because somebody was asking like, well, what are you guys going to call yourselves? I'm like, I said, I don't know why. And maybe this is confirmation. I said, I keep thinking Fort Resilience Homestead.
Nice.
I want the resilience. I want the resilience because
that.
it's about being able to take care. It's about being able to not only provide for my family, but also to provide for people like in our church. I'm a big believer that so many of the problems that we're experiencing in the country today is because, at around the turn of the century in the 1920s, it really started picking up. But at some point, we decided that we were going to render to Caesar things that didn't belong to Caesar.
Right.
And then the church was just going to be a place we went to on Sundays. And that's not what the church is.
No.
The church is supposed to be there as an infrastructure, as the body of Christ, to be able to represent love, support, and that's spiritual, that's emotional, but that's also physical needs. It's meeting physical needs. And when we started to see issues with supply chain, when we started to see issues with inflation and everything else, I was like, it's not that I want to like depart from society or anything like that.
Right.
But I also don't want to be totally dependent on things that are completely outside of our control. If we have people within our church, if we have people within our small group that are ever in a position where they need help, I want to know that we have the capacity and the know-how to be able to help provide for some of those basic necessities. And I think it's just it teaches great lessons for your kids to take care of animals. So this next year we're upping our game.
Nice.
It would be very bold to call it a homestead, but we'll just say at this point we got our little we're the goal next year is to hopefully come out of next year where we've kind of cut out the grocery store by about like 50 to 70%.
Awesome.
And then to be able to help other people that are interested in doing the same thing. And like I said, I love the community. I see so many people in there. What I love the most about them is they're excited to show you how to do it. They're honest about their own failures when it comes to it, and it's just great.
You mentioned a pig twice, and you referenced you used to have a pig. Does that mean you have bacon, or did he just get loose and run away?
Oh, no. We had, not only did we have bacon, we had something that I might market one day. We called it stakin'. So what we did is when we took the pig to get processed and everything, you said, yeah, hey, we want thick cut bacon, so they cut up they had one piece that they forgot to cut up. And so we're looking at this in our freezer like, what is this? It's like, well, this is just one big, I'm like, oh, that's stakin'. And I remember, nice. I think the kids were like with grandparents or something like that, and my wife looks at me, she goes, what do you want? You want me to cut it up? I'm like, no. Let's just prepare that.
I love that.
And it was, oh my gosh, it was good. It was good.
Well, and folks listening, you don't have to have a bunch of acreage to provide even some basic things. You can do something inside your house. There's hydroponics for people living in the city. And I would say this, because I what you're hearing is not a prepper. It's someone who's prepared, so you don't have to be paranoid. And there are extremists. I had a pastor that lives by me, and when Antifa and all that was happening, he's kind of a scaredy cat dude. And he was like, hey, Victor, I got 1,000 rounds. If they come into where we live, is that enough? And I was like, Pastor man, how many people you want to kill?
Yeah.
And I go, I just can't. We have a house in Iraq. We've lived the apocalypse.
Yeah.
Miles from ISIS, trenches around. Life goes on. And people need to understand that. Life goes on because people will go, hey, I got some pigs and I'm going to sell some at market. I've got some tomatoes. You'll be amazed at if things get really bad, how conscientious and helpful people are. Yeah, I'm an EMT. I can help. But any type of preparedness. And we would always recommend try to prepare for a few weeks to a few months. That if there was a disruption in our system, you'd be good. And as a Christian, I would just say this: don't be like this pastor friend of mine who's like, I'm hoarding everything, and anybody that comes around, I'll never forget. I called his attention when I said, "Hey, pastor man, why don't you just, if they were trying to mob your house, just shoot one person and let them stay in your yard for a while." I said, that smell will be.
Am I being at that point?
Yeah. He was like, "Oh," I said, "Trust me. Well, when somebody swells up, it'll turn people away."
I was telling someone was asking me because they were kind of teasing me that I'm sitting here like back in the day it was like, oh yeah, jumping out of planes and doing explosive breaches on CQB houses and stuff like that, and now I'm like, look at how well my tomatoes are doing, right? And one of the things I tell people, and I'll tell fellow vets this too, there is something like really like peaceful and therapeutic about doing this, whether it's going down and like feeding the goats or like I'll go out there and I'll let the goats out and I'll let them kind of free range a little bit, or I'll do the same thing with the chickens. And chickens are hysterical to watch. So many of our like modern colloquialisms come from chickens, and you see it. Yeah, you see them. But going out there and like tending a garden. I mean, let's face it, that was the first job God gave to man, was tending a garden.
Yep.
And there is something about that process of facilitating growth, and then being able to use that growth to teach your kids, to be able to use that to feed your family. Not to mention the fact that there's all these other ancillary benefits, right? Like it tastes better, I think. I mean, the eggs from our chickens, I love them. And then, we have one of my daughters has an autoimmune disease.
Yep.
And so like we had to go through that whole process of figuring out, okay, which foods, and a lot of times it's, it's this, garbage preservative stuff,
Yep.
which,
Yep.
look, it serves a purpose, right? Not all of it's bad, right? But that doesn't mean it's all healthy.
Yes.
And so going through the process of being able to identify things and be able to provide for that and being in a position where it's like, okay, there's going to be something we can provide for our daughter that we know is going to be good for her. And for all our kids. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of, but like you said, we got 10 acres. You can do a lot with 10 acres, but man, you don't need 10 acres to do a lot. There is so much you can do and starting. Chickens are a great place to start. We always joke that's the gateway drug to livestock. and just gardening, man, you'll be surprised at the amount of food that you can produce in a relatively small area with a little bit of, just attention to detail.
Yeah, we've got a little place out here, a little ranch, and we're very fortunate. And I mean, just to watch elk or deer walk on the place, you just go, my goodness. And then there was a very wicked squirrel. I mean, he was like, killing, beating up other squirrels and choking birds. So my daughter shot him. And it was
this be the tyrant squirrels.
Yes. I go, honey, you just saved a lot of little animals who would have been murdered by this bad guy. So, yeah, folks, again, talking to vets or anybody in high-stress jobs, one of the things few people talk about is the decompression needed. And I speak to myself. I'm thinking to myself about this too. It's a type of purification process when you come out of stressful things, and you got to have something. You got to have something. And really, gardening is pretty amazing. Brother, I've really enjoyed this time and getting to know you and becoming friends and realizing we've got mutual friends. Yeah. I have two questions I ask all my guests. There's no wrong answers in that it's yours. But the first one's based on perception, and because people make observations and decisions based on perceptions. But what is your perception of me and what I do?
So I would say my perception and understanding of what you do has to do with utilizing the skills that you have in order to protect people that desperately need protection that God has put on your heart in order to do so. And then to also be able to provide mentorship for other people, not only ones that are interested in that same field or maybe feel a call into that same field, but just kind of this general purpose with respect to what does godly masculinity, what does godly responsibility look like? And part of that, I would say my other part of the perception of you on that is also being honest with your successes, honest with your failures, and honest with your past. And I think that's the reason why I bring that up is kind of like to wrap all that up. There's a whole lot of, on social media, you see this all the time. There's a whole lot of this like fake machismo.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what a lot of people are rebelling against. And unfortunately what they've done is they've taken that fake machismo and they've turned that into masculinity. That isn't masculinity. Yeah. And so I see you as helping to provide guidance in that field while at the same time being authentic about it. And that authenticity is really, really important because I think people can see right through it when it's something else, or they can see right through it when you're motivated by something else. So that would be my perception.
Thank you.
But I know I could get to know you and find out you're a real jerk. I don't know.
Yeah, well, and I wouldn't rule that out. As
I mean, you are a Marine.
Yeah, I stood in the wrong line, but they had those little crayons. A little factoid is I used to work for Dr. James Dobson.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I was his assistant to him.
Yeah.
And he was my boss who became my mentor, who became a friend. And actually him and his bride were out here at our training center. And my wife was teaching Shirley how to shoot. And then I got Doc behind a weapon he hadn't shot in a while, and he was we tapped into that masculinity, and so it does matter to hear from and see. I call role models, but more importantly, real models, and that's there is a benefit to social media for people to take little nuggets away from folks. I think people, when they go to your Instagram or your social medias and see your short pontification on issues with your cup of coffee, it brings sanity. Do you know that? I don't know if anybody's ever told you that, but in a just a chaotic and crazy world, your little sarcastic wisdom, it brings sanity to people for a moment. It's like, okay, I'm not crazy. He is making sense. I am thinking right. So thanks for what you do. Last question. You and I have been around death, and everybody will die. So this is the last question I ask all of my guests, and that is, and I did a podcast earlier with a young man, and I asked him this question. That was actually a funny, pretty good podcast because he's left-leaning. His Instagram is New Evangelicals, and he's, I call him a whiner, and, he doesn't understand. He voted for Biden, and it was just really great. And I just got to tell you this, you get a chuckle. This is how we started off the deal. I said, hey, I just want to ask him, we were recording, it's actually on the podcast, people see it. I pull out a bag and I go, I'm going to find out if these things trigger you, young man. And I pull out a cap with a flag. He goes, nope, I'm not triggered too much. So how about this? And then it's Leonidas with stars and stripes. And he's like, actually, I'm Greek, so I like it. I said, oh. And then I unzip my jacket, and I've got full kit on.
Yeah.
Literally. Look at here. I got full kit and body armor, and I pull out some mags. I go, these are bullets. And he goes, and then I pull out a shotgun. But folks, you ought to check that podcast out. That it ended up being a fascinating, great dialogue with differing views, but some commonalities. That was really good. But I asked him, and I'll ask you, what happens to Nick when you die? When you close your eyes for the last time? Yeah.
I get to be with Christ. Not because of anything, not because ultimately of anything I did, but because of the sacrifice that he made and my acceptance of it. And so I can say that with absolute certainty. And I can also say it with absolute humility. Because I think that's important. There's this idea, I think sometimes there can be an arrogance in the way that we discuss that.
Yeah.
And it can come across with our assurance, but like I cannot emphasize that part enough. It's the absolute humility of that, because it is completely undeserved. It is completely undeserved. And I think that when you recognize that as the truth, and I do a lot of work in Christian apologetics. I think it's very important to be able to make a good, logical, empirical argument for my faith. But it really does, when you get hit in the face with the reality that you are going to be able to experience that when you die, not because of anything you did, but because of the sacrifice that was made, because he so desperately wanted to be able to have that relationship. It changes the way you look at the world. It changes the way that you look at other people. And believe me, there are plenty of times where I still mess this up. But one of my favorite verses is Peter 3:15. First, sanctify Christ in your heart, and always be prepared to give a response for the hope that is in you, but to do so with gentleness and respect. And there's times where I screw up on the gentleness and respect. But
me and you both.
Yeah, that's where I'll be. And again, I say that with complete humility. Yeah.
Love that. The young man who was on here, when I asked him the question, he said, I don't know. and he was homeschooled, raised in an evangelical church, became a youth pastor, did, I think, worship. But he was so hurt by the church, by men in leadership not being accountable for certain abuses and different things. And Nick, there's a large group of young people that fall into that. And a lot of it's based on the arrogance that some people in ministry and what dehumanizing people, not love. And my heart breaks because he said, I think we either all live together in harmony and reign with Christ, or we just die and don't exist any longer. But he said, I don't believe in a literal hell. And I never try to change people's opinions, even though I know the truth, unless I'm asked. And I told him, and I tell folks, spending so much time around Muslims, Muslims that ask me, and I remember an ISIS fighter, just been captured. We were in Mosul, and it was all happening pretty quick. And I got to spend some time with him. And I remember saying, do you know what's going to happen when you die? And he's like, inshallah, inshallah. And I said, can I share with you my assurance of salvation, what I have as assurance? He said, yes. And I was able to share that with him. And I told him, before the lights go out, you should call out to Jesus because he can give you that assurance. But I appreciate how you added that, because I get guys on here and women, and everybody has their own point. I interview everybody because I love doing this. And it's the humility and love, because that really is it. It's so undeserving. How do we deserve salvation? How can Christians be arrogant about something that has, it's by grace we're saved, by faith, lest any man should boast. And I'm thankful we have like beliefs, and we'll be able to be in the presence of Christ. Hey, if you're out there listening right now, watching, you may say, dang, I don't have that assurance that y'all are talking about. Y'all both really act like you believe it. It's because we do. And we'd like to just tell you, you can have that assurance by, I think it's sin that separates us from God. It's our own will. But Jesus, he's reconciled us to the Father. And how would you say it, Nick? How would you tell somebody that they can actually have a relationship with God through Christ, or have that level of assurance? What would you tell them?
I think I definitely believe that my faith is not just an intellectual conviction; it's also a relationship. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting. A lot of the people that I talk to, like you said, they have hurt, they have feelings of they've been betrayed. That doesn't make sense to them, and I usually start with this idea that I think people sometimes have this expectation that, well, why didn't God just create something that was perfect and easy and wonderful and we're all happy? And it's like, well, he did. It was called the garden.
Yeah.
The difference is that there's only one sort of reality where love and justice can exist. And it's the sort of reality where you have the choice to choose the opposite. And I like the concepts of love and justice. But when somebody runs afoul of justice, when they break the law, there is punishment, there is consequences. Because if there isn't, then there's no justice. So how do you overcome it? Well, the way God overcame it was through Christ. And sometimes I think it looks to us as if, well, why couldn't he have done it a different way? Well, because the moment he does it a different way, there's no justice, because now we got away with it, right? Mm. The moment he just lets us go, well, there's no love now. There's no sacrifice associated with that. It just, like, we can see it in our personal lives when somebody loves you so much that they're willing to tell you the truth, but they're also willing to sacrifice them. They're also willing to sacrifice something in order to save you. There is something in that moment that clicks with us, that we just understand that in that moment, I was truly loved, not because of something I did. I was truly loved, But by the same token, justice wasn't sacrificed in order to experience that love. And if you can kind of understand that in the microcosm of the experiences that we sometimes have, and then you can understand how Christ coming, Christ living a perfect life, Christ sacrificing himself in order to facilitate that reconciliation. That is the method that provides both that love and that justice. It leaves them both perfectly intact. And then it's the realization that, man, but he didn't have to do it. And he did it anyways because of that desire for relationship. And so coming to grips with that, sometimes the door is through an intellectual one in order to get the relationship. Sometimes it's just having that impact or that moment or something that happens in your life that exposes you to it. And then, but that's what I would try to tell somebody, is that this isn't just hocus pocus, right? This isn't wish fulfillment. Right. This isn't Santa Claus or Sky Daddy or any of the other pejoratives that are used. When we look at human experience, this makes sense. And I was raised a Christian, but it really was not active in my life for a long time. And it was another Green Beret who I respected as an operator, who I respected as a man, who started to really, get to the root and the foundation of some of these issues, some of these questions that I had, and explaining it to a point where, man, when it clicked and you understood it, it's an absolute game changer. But the one thing I can tell you is that it makes sense. And I don't know why I keep hammering on that point right now, but
because there's somebody that needs to hear that. There's someone that's listening that just needs it to make sense. So let me just say a little prayer, because I believe prayer works in ways I don't even understand it. But God, you know the person listening or watching right now desires a relationship with you. We know it's no magical words, but Lord, you say if we seek you with our heart, we'll find you. And Lord, you draw them into yourself, and you're not willing that any should perish, but have everlasting life. And I pray for that person or people right now, they would just call out to you. That you'd make yourself real, that you would Lord, let them know how much they're loved, and let them not believe the lies of the enemy any longer, or things they told themselves. And I pray, God, that you would touch them in a way that is so profound that they would know you're real, and they would grow both intellectually in their faith, but also experientially, knowing that you're there with them. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Well, folks, listen, you've listened to my guest today, Nick, and many of you are intrigued, I know. Nick, what's the best way folks can follow you or go to a website to learn more or get on your podcast?
Oh, I appreciate it. We have our podcast is Making the Argument. If people are on social media, we're on all the platforms. We're on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and YouTube and everything else. They can just type in Nick Freitas, or they can type in Making the Argument. And we provide a link tree in our Instagram. So if people want to see all the different platforms that we're on, they can just click on that, and that'll take them to whatever venue they prefer.
Fantastic. Folks, wherever you are and whatever you're doing, you know how I always say, do it for the glory of God. Man, there's such satisfaction in that. And do it full throttle. That's your place on this earth for a reason. And God loves you. We love you too. Now, go get it done.
Thanks for joining us for today's episode. We'd love to stay connected with you and invite you to the conversation beyond this podcast. You can check out more of the work we're doing around the world at victormarks.com, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all linked in the show notes. Be sure to drop us a comment in the review section if today's show has impacted you in any way, or if there's anything you'd like to hear more of. We're always encouraged to hear from you. Thanks for spending your time with us. Until next time.